The apartment was cloaked in silence until Sarah Johnson screamed, a sound torn from her chest that echoed against the narrow walls like a haunting confession. Her arms clutched her son, Daniel Johnson, as though he were the last thread tying her to sanity. Mark Davis stormed out, his face twisted with rage, the slam of the door rattling the frame like a thunderclap. Sarah's breath caught, her thoughts splintering between terror and defiance. She whispered, "Daniel, we're safe now," though her voice trembled with doubt. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, filling the night with dread. Her body shook, but she held her child tighter, every tear betraying her fear and strength. Daniel's small fingers gripped her sleeve, his wide eyes seeking answers she couldn't give. Mark's shadow lingered even in absence, a ghost of betrayal that threatened to suffocate them both. Sarah's heart raced, her mind already preparing for battles she hadn't chosen. The air felt heavy, suffused with a truth she could no longer deny. Life as she knew it was gone. And in that fleeting, terrible moment, she understood that the fight for her son had only just begun. Morning light crept through worn curtains as Sarah Johnson sat motionless at the kitchen table. Daniel Johnson rubbed his sleepy eyes, his small voice breaking the silence when he said, "Mom, is he gone for good?" Sarah forced a smile, though her heart felt heavy. She replied softly, "Yes, Daniel, we're okay." The kettle whistled, steam clouding the air like ghosts of the night before. Sarah's hands shook as she poured tea, her mind replaying every word Mark Davis had shouted. She thought of how his anger always turned to violence, and how she had sworn to keep Daniel safe from that cycle. Her body ached from sleepless hours, yet her resolve hardened. She whispered to herself, "No one will take him away." Daniel leaned against her, unaware of the battles looming beyond his small world. The kitchen, though cluttered and dim, became a fortress of fragile calm. Every sound, every movement carried unspoken promises she would fight, no matter the cost, to protect what little family she had left. Later that morning, Sarah Johnson walked Daniel Johnson to school, her hand clasping his tightly. The street buzzed with life, but Sarah felt every eye on her, every whisper about last night's screams. Daniel looked up and said, "Mom, will you pick me up today?" She forced cheer into her tone, answering, "Always, Daniel. I'll always be here." Her heart, however, twisted at the thought of Mark Davis returning to claim custody. The school gates loomed like barriers, and Sarah hesitated before letting go of Daniel's hand. She bent low, kissed his cheek, and whispered, "Be brave." He nodded solemnly, walking toward the building with small steps, glancing back once more. Sarah stood rooted, her chest heavy, as the gate closed between them. The world moved on around her, yet she felt trapped in a war no one else could see. She knew the day would be long, filled with questions she didn't have answers for. But her promise remained. Daniel would never face it alone. Alone again, Sarah Johnson walked back home, her footsteps echoing through the quiet streets. Memories of Mark Davis's violent words gnawed at her resolve. She whispered under her breath, "He will not break us." A passing neighbor glanced at her with pity, their eyes saying what their mouth dared not. Sarah quickened her pace, each step heavy with fear of unseen threats. Inside the apartment, she sat on the couch, staring at the empty doorway where Mark once stood. She remembered the years of lies, the promises he shattered, and the loneliness that followed. Her phone buzzed with a message, his name glowing on the screen. Her pulse quickened as she read his words, "This isn't over." The room seemed to shrink, walls pressing inward, air thick with dread. Yet in the midst of fear, Sarah closed her eyes and breathed deeply, whispering, "I will fight." The silence after felt like both a curse and a vow, her spirit trembling yet unbroken. That evening, Sarah Johnson stood at the kitchen counter chopping vegetables, her hands moving with mechanical rhythm. Daniel Johnson sat at the table drawing, crayons scattered like tiny bursts of hope across the surface. He said softly, "Mom, can we be happy again?" Her knife paused mid-air, her throat tightening as she replied, "Aye, Daniel, we will be happy again, I promise." The air smelled of onions and garlic, familiar comforts, in a storm of chaos. Sarah fought to steady her voice, swallowing the truth that happiness now came at a price. She looked at her son's innocent face and felt her resolve harden. She thought of Mark Davis, of the battles ahead, of courts and custody papers. But in that kitchen, with Daniel humming quietly as he colored, Sarah found strength. She whispered silently, "For him, I will endure anything." The shadows of night gathered outside, but inside their small home, a fragile flame of hope flickered against the dark. Sarah Johnson sat at her office desk, her fingers resting on the keyboard but unmoving. The glow of the computer screen reflected the storm of thoughts inside her mind. Her coworker whispered in the hall, the weight of gossip hanging in the air. Sarah heard every muffled word about her struggles, about the shouting neighbors claimed to have heard. She closed her eyes, fighting the sting of humiliation. Her supervisor entered, his tone clipped when he said, "Sarah, your focus is slipping." Her lips parted with a protest, but she stopped herself, swallowing the truth with a bitter taste. She forced out, "I'll do better." His sigh carried doubt rather than trust, and his retreating footsteps left the room heavier than before. Sarah turned back to her screen, the lines of numbers blurring. The image of Daniel Johnson's face filled her mind, reminding her of why she had to endure. She clenched her fists, whispering, "For him." Outside the window, rain streaked the glass, echoing the quiet unraveling of her strength. The office lunchroom buzzed faintly, but Sarah Johnson sat apart at a corner table, her lunch untouched. Emily Carter entered, her best friend since college, sliding into the chair beside her with a warm smile. "You look like you've been carrying the world," Emily said softly. Sarah's lips trembled before she whispered, "It's falling apart, Emily." Emily's eyes softened, her hand resting on Sarah's. "You're stronger than you think." For the first time that day, Sarah allowed her shoulders to relax, just a fraction. She whispered, "Mark won't stop. He'll come after Daniel." Emily's voice sharpened, "Then we'll stop him." Sarah blinked at the word "we," a fragile thread of hope stitching itself into her despair. The sound of coworkers laughing across the room faded as she clung to Emily's steady presence. In that moment, Sarah realized she wasn't entirely alone, though fear still pressed against her chest like a shadow that refused to leave. That evening, Sarah Johnson arrived at the apartment late, fatigue clinging to her body. Daniel Johnson bounded toward her, his drawing clutched in small hands. "Look, Mom, it's us in the park," he said with a smile that cut through her exhaustion. She knelt, pulling him close. "It's beautiful, Daniel," she whispered, her tears hidden against his hair. The paper trembled in her hands, a fragile symbol of innocence she was desperate to protect. In that moment, the shrill ring of her phone shattered the peace. Mark Davis' name glowed across the screen. Her stomach twisted as she let it ring, Daniel watching her face with questioning eyes. She forced a smile, brushing his hair back. "Let's put your drawing on the fridge," she said, pushing the phone aside. But as she walked into the kitchen, the weight of the unanswered call lingered like a storm on the horizon. Fear and resolve collided in her chest, shaping her into a woman ready to fight. Later that night, Sarah Johnson lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The room was quiet, except for Daniel Johnson's steady breathing beside her. Her thoughts spun with relentless speed, weaving fears of custody battles, of courtrooms, of losing him. Memories of Mark Davis's anger replayed, each scene sharper than the last. She whispered into the darkness, "He won't win." The words sounded hollow, swallowed by shadows. Daniel stirred, murmuring in his sleep, and Sarah turned to watch his small face, softened by dreams. She brushed his hair back, whispering, "I'll protect you." Her heart ached with the weight of promises she wasn't sure she could keep, yet her spirit clung to them fiercely. The silence of night wrapped around them like a fragile shield. In the dim glow of the bedside lamp, Sarah finally closed her eyes, not in peace but in defiance, carrying her fears into uneasy sleep. Morning broke with gray skies and heavy clouds. Sarah Johnson rushed to prepare Daniel Johnson for school, her movements frantic as though time itself pressed against her. Daniel tugged on her sleeve, asking softly, "Mom, are you okay?" She forced a smile, crouching to meet his eyes. "Yes, Daniel, I just want you to be safe." Her words carried a weight she couldn't hide. The knock on the door came sharp and sudden. Sarah froze, her body rigid. Slowly, she opened it to find a man in a suit standing there, a social worker named Michael Harris. His expression was professional but distant as he said, "Ms. Johnson, we need to talk about custody arrangements." Sarah's chest tightened, her breath catching in disbelief. Daniel clung to her leg, wide-eyed. She steadied herself, whispering, "We're not giving up." The world seemed to tilt, but in her heart, fire flickered. The battle was no longer distant. It was at her doorstep. Sarah Johnson sat in the living room as dusk settled, her friend Emily Carter at her side. The shadows lengthened on the walls as Emily hesitated before saying, "Sarah, I need to tell you something." Sarah turned sharply, fear rising in her chest. Emily's voice faltered. "I knew Mark Davis had been planning something. I didn't know how to tell you." Sarah's stomach clenched, betrayal cutting deeper than she imagined. She whispered, "You knew." Emily's eyes brimmed with guilt, tears threatening to spill. The silence between them felt like a chasm, every second heavier than the last. Sarah stood, pacing the room, her voice shaking. "You were the one I trusted." Emily reached out, desperate. "I was trying to protect you." Sarah turned away, staring at the door, as if Mark's shadow lingered there. She pressed her palm to her forehead, whispering, "Everything is falling apart." Emily's silence confirmed what Sarah feared. She was more alone than ever. The next day, Sarah Johnson sat in her supervisor, Richard Miller's office, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Richard's voice was cold. "Your performance has slipped, Sarah. I can't ignore it anymore." Her heart sank, images of Daniel Johnson's smile flashing in her mind. She fought for composure, replying softly, "I've been dealing with personal issues, but I can manage." Richard's frown deepened. "The board is watching, and they won't accept excuses." Sarah's chest tightened as fear took root, realizing her job, her only stability, was at risk. The clock ticked loudly, each second dragging her closer to collapse. She whispered to herself, "Not now, not this." Richard leaned back, crossing his arms, his expression distant. "I need improvement or consequences will follow." Sarah stood, her voice trembling but firm. "I won't let this break me." As she left the office, her resolve clashed with dread. The walls of her world continued to crumble, piece by fragile piece. That evening, Sarah Johnson found Daniel Johnson drawing again at the kitchen table, crayons scattered. He looked up and asked, "Mom, why are you sad?" She forced a smile, sitting beside him. "I'm just tired, Daniel." He pointed to his picture of a family holding hands and whispered, "Well, always be together, right?" Her throat tightened as she kissed his hair. "Always," she answered, though fear clawed at her chest. The phone rang suddenly, breaking the fragile peace. Mark Davis' voice came through like poison. "You can't keep him from me, Sarah. This fight isn't over." Her hand trembled as she replied, "I will protect Daniel." His laugh was cruel before the line went dead. Sarah pressed the phone down, her body trembling, Daniel watching silently. She pulled him close, whispering, "You're safe." Yet deep down, she knew the storm was only beginning. The night carried the weight of a war she could not escape. The next morning, Sarah Johnson visited Emily Carter's apartment, determination replacing her exhaustion. Emily opened the door, her face etched with worry. "Sarah," she whispered, "I'm sorry." Sarah's tone was sharp. "Sorry won't undo what's been done." Emily pleaded, "I didn't want to hurt you. Mark Davis pressured me. He said if I didn't help, he'd ruin me too." Sarah's eyes narrowed, betrayal layered with sorrow. "You chose his threats over our friendship." Emily's hands trembled, tears streaking her cheeks. "I thought I was protecting both of us." Sarah turned away, her voice cold. "You've left me to fight this alone." The silence that followed was deafening, a fracture too deep to mend. Sarah walked down the hall, every step heavy with heartbreak, her mind echoing with loss not only of safety, but of trust. Emily stood frozen, whispering Sarah's name, but the sound faded into emptiness. That night, Sarah Johnson sat in the apartment, staring at custody papers that had been slipped under her door. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the legal notice from Mark Davis, his intent clear: he was coming for Daniel Johnson. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. Daniel approached quietly, holding his stuffed toy, asking, "Mom, what's wrong?" Sarah wiped her face quickly and smiled faintly. "Nothing, Daniel, go rest." But as he walked back to his room, Sarah's strength cracked, her shoulders shaking silently. She whispered to herself, "He won't take you." The room felt colder, shadows stretching across the walls like grasping hands. She stared at the papers again, fear twisting into fury. For the first time, she allowed anger to burn brighter than her tears. The storm outside rattled the windows, echoing the chaos in her heart. She knew then the battle was no longer avoidable. It was war. The knock at the apartment door startled Sarah Johnson, her heart pounding with dread. She expected Mark Davis or another letter from the court, but instead she found David Johnson standing there, older and weathered, a ghost from her past. "Hello, Sarah," he said quietly, his voice heavy with years of absence. Her throat tightened, words caught between anger and relief. Daniel Johnson peeked from behind her, curiosity in his wide eyes. Sarah whispered, "Why now?" David shifted uncomfortably, his eyes shadowed. "Because you need me." Memories of abandonment rushed back, nights when David had vanished from their family without explanation. Sarah clenched the doorframe, torn between slamming it shut and letting him in. Daniel tugged her hand, whispering, "Mom, who is he?" Sarah's voice trembled, "He's your uncle." The silence that followed was raw, filled with questions that had waited years for answers. For the first time in a long while, Sarah felt both fear and possibility standing at her door. Inside the apartment, Sarah Johnson paced the room, while David Johnson sat stiffly on the couch. Daniel Johnson perched on the edge of his chair, staring curiously at this new presence. Sarah's voice shook with restrained anger. "You abandoned me, David. For years you left me to fight alone." David lowered his gaze, guilt carved into his expression. "I stayed away because I thought I would only make things worse." Sarah snapped, "You made it worse by disappearing." Daniel glanced between them, sensing the storm but unable to understand. David's tone softened. "I've been keeping watch, Sarah. I know about Mark Davis, and I know how far he is willing to go." Her chest tightened as the truth sank in. David had been closer than she realized, a silent shadow over her life. She whispered, "Why didn't you tell me?" His answer was quiet, "Because I didn't think you'd forgive me." The air thickened, layered with pain and fragile hope. Later that night, Sarah Johnson and David Johnson sat across from each other at the kitchen table. The silence between them was thick, broken only when David placed an envelope on the table. Sarah's hand hovered before she opened it, revealing documents and photographs of Mark Davis meeting with a lawyer. David's voice was steady, "He's building a case to destroy you." Sarah's stomach churned, her breath quickening as she flipped through the evidence. "How did you get these?" she asked, suspicion still lacing her tone. David replied, "I've been tracking him for months. I couldn't stay away knowing what he was doing." Sarah's fingers trembled, fury rising as the weight of betrayal deepened. "So you were watching all this time," she said bitterly. David met her eyes, his expression unflinching. "I was waiting for the right time to step in." The words echoed, stirring both anger and reluctant gratitude within her heart. The weight of the revelation pressed heavily on Sarah Johnson's shoulders. She stood by the window, staring at the rain streaking the glass. David Johnson remained seated, his voice quiet but firm. "You can't face Mark Davis alone." Sarah turned sharply, fire in her eyes. "I've been facing him alone for years." David rose slowly, his stance steady. "Then let me stand with you now." Sarah's chest heaved, torn between pride and the longing for support she had denied herself for so long. Daniel Johnson stirred in the next room, his soft voice calling, "Mom?" Sarah's resolve cracked slightly, her eyes softening. She whispered, "I can't risk losing him." David stepped closer, his expression resolute. "You won't. Not while I'm here." For the first time, Sarah allowed the idea of leaning on someone else to settle within her heart, though fears still lingered. The storm outside mirrored the turmoil between them, fierce and unrelenting. By midnight, the apartment had grown quiet, but Sarah Johnson and David Johnson still sat at the table. Daniel Johnson had fallen asleep in his room, unaware of the storm gathering around him. Sarah's eyes were red from tears, but her voice carried strength as she said, "If you stand with me, it means facing everything we've both run from." David nodded solemnly. "I've run enough, Sarah. It's time I make it right." The words lingered like an oath, cutting through years of silence. Sarah studied his face, seeing the brother she had loved and the man who had abandoned her, now standing as both. She whispered, "Then we fight together." The quiet hum of the refrigerator and the faint patter of rain became the only witnesses to their vow. For the first time in years, Sarah felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't completely alone in the battle ahead. The courthouse hallway smelled faintly of polished wood and fear. Sarah Johnson sat on a bench, her fingers locked tightly around Daniel Johnson's backpack, though he wasn't there. David Johnson stood beside her, steady but silent. The door to the courtroom loomed like a fortress. Sarah whispered, "They'll try to paint me as unfit." David's voice was calm, "Then we'll show them the truth." Her breath trembled, every step closer to the hearing feeling heavier. Across the hall, Mark Davis leaned against the wall, smirking at her as though victory already belonged to him. Sarah's stomach churned as his lawyer Richard Hall whispered in his ear, both of them glancing her way with cold amusement. She swallowed her fear, whispering again, "For Daniel, I can't break." David's hand rested on her shoulder, grounding her as the clerk called her name. The wooden doors creaked open, and Sarah felt the weight of judgment ready to consume her. Inside the courtroom, Sarah Johnson sat at the wooden table, her eyes fixed on Judge Richard Bennett, who shuffled papers with detached authority. Across from her, Mark Davis leaned back confidently, Richard Hall whispering strategies into his ear. Sarah's chest rose and fell quickly, every breath sharp with fear. David Johnson sat behind her, his silent support a lifeline. The judge finally spoke. "We are here to address custody matters for Daniel Johnson." Sarah's heart clenched as Mark's smirk widened. Richard Hall stood declaring, "Mems, Johnson has a history of instability. We have witnesses." Sarah's lips parted in disbelief, tears threatening. She rose, her voice unsteady but resolute. "I've sacrificed everything for my son. That's not instability, that's love." The words hung in the room, heavy and raw. For the first time, Judge Richard Bennett looked up, his eyes searching hers. The air seemed to freeze, the fight fully underway. That evening, Sarah Johnson sat at the kitchen table, exhaustion carving shadows under her eyes. Daniel Johnson worked on homework nearby, his small voice breaking the silence. "Mom, did I do something wrong?" Her chest tightened painfully. She forced a smile, whispering, "No, Daniel, you've done everything right." He frowned softly. "Then why are they fighting?" Sarah blinked back, tears stroking his hair. "Because people sometimes forget what matters most." Daniel pressed his drawing into her hand, a picture of their family holding hands with David Johnson drawn beside them. She studied it, her eyes wet, whispering, "You're stronger than all of us." Daniel leaned against her, his warmth grounding her weary spirit. For the first time that day, she allowed herself to breathe deeply. Outside, thunder rolled in the distance, a reminder that the storm wasn't over. But inside the kitchen, a fragile peace flickered like a candle in the dark. A week later, Sarah Johnson walked nervously into the Family Support Center for a scheduled evaluation. The air smelled of antiseptic and paper, walls lined with posters about family welfare. Michael Harris, the social worker, greeted her formally, his clipboard in hand. "Ness Johnson will be observing your interactions today." Sarah's pulse quickened as Daniel Johnson clung to her hand, whispering, "I don't like this place." She crouched, kissing his forehead. Just be yourself, Daniel. Michael's expression remained unreadable as he observed every movement. Sarah read books with Daniel, played simple games, and listened to his laughter, though anxiety gnawed at her with every glance Michael wrote down. At one point, Daniel said softly, "Mom makes me feel safe." Sarah's throat tightened, her arms wrapping around him instinctively. Michael looked up briefly, his expression flickering. Sarah held her son tighter, knowing that every second was an unspoken trial. That night, Sarah Johnson sat by the apartment window, city lights glowing faintly beyond the glass. David Johnson poured coffee, placing a mug beside her. He said quietly, "You did well today." She shook her head, her eyes distant. "I felt judged for every breath I took." David sat beside her, his voice steady. "They can't take away what Daniel feels for you." Her lips trembled as she whispered, "But what if it's not enough?" David leaned closer, his gaze firm. "It is enough, Sarah. You're his world." Sarah turned her eyes toward him, studying his sincerity, and for the first time allowed a small flicker of gratitude. Silence fell, broken only by the hum of the city. Across the room, Daniel stirred in his sleep, murmuring softly. Sarah whispered, "For him, I'll keep fighting." The weight of the battle pressed on her shoulders, but the fire within her refused to dim. The courtroom was packed with silence as Sarah Johnson sat at the plaintiff's table, her pulse pounding in her ears. David Johnson sat behind her, steady as stone. Judge Richard Bennett entered, his robe flowing as he took his seat. Mark Davis leaned forward at his table, smirk tugging at his lips, while Richard Hall whispered in his ear. Sarah clenched her fists, whispering, "For Daniel, I must not fall." The judge spoke firmly. "We begin final arguments." Richard Hall rose, his voice sharp. "Ms. Johnson has demonstrated instability and cannot provide a secure home." His words stabbed through her chest, but Sarah's eyes burned with fire. She stood, her voice steady despite the quake in her hands. "I've given every piece of myself to raise Daniel Johnson. Sacrifice is not instability, it is love." The room fell silent, Judge Richard Bennett's gaze fixed on her, and for the first time, Sarah felt her truth begin to cut through the lies. The air thickened as Sarah Johnson returned to her seat, her breath shallow. Mark Davis stood suddenly, his voice filled with venom. "She's lying. She has hidden her failures, and Daniel deserves better." Gasps rippled through the room as Sarah's body stiffened. David Johnson rose instinctively, his voice sharp. "Enough, Mar." The judge's gavel struck wood, demanding order. Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she rose once more, staring directly at Mark Davis. Her words cut through the chaos. "You left us broken, Mark, and now you dare pretend you care." Mark's smirk faltered, his mask cracking under her unwavering stare. For a moment, silence reigned, the truth echoing louder than his accusations. The courtroom became a battlefield, and Sarah finally stood not as a victim, but as a mother fighting with everything she had left. Later, in the hallway outside the courtroom, Sarah Johnson leaned against the wall, her chest heaving. David Johnson handed her a bottle of water, murmuring, "You showed them your truth." Sarah shook her head, whispering, "It feels like they only see his lies." Suddenly, Mark Davis emerged from the doors, Richard Hall at his side. He stopped, sneering. "This isn't over, Sarah. Daniel will be mine." Sarah straightened, fury burning through exhaustion. Her voice was steel. "Daniel isn't a prize to be won. He's my son, and I will never let you destroy him." Mark's jaw tightened, anger flashing in his eyes. David stepped forward, blocking his path, his tone low and dangerous. "Stay away from her." The tension crackled like electricity, until a bailiff ordered them apart. Sarah stood taller, realizing she would never cower again. That night, Sarah Johnson sat on the couch, her hands trembling as she clutched Daniel Johnson close. He whispered, "Mom, I'm scared he'll take me away." Her chest broke at the sound, tears spilling freely as she kissed his forehead. "I won't let him, Daniel. I promise." David Johnson sat nearby, silent but vigilant, watching the storm rage inside his sister. The apartment felt smaller than ever, walls heavy with fear, and the echo of Mark Davis's threats. Daniel clung tighter, his voice muffled. "You make me feel safe." Sarah's tears fell harder, her voice steady though her body shook. "And I will keep you safe no matter what." The promise was iron in her chest, forged in years of sacrifice and pain. In that moment, fear transformed into unyielding resolve, a fire she would carry into the final fight. The next morning, Sarah Johnson stood outside the courthouse steps, the sky heavy with gray clouds. She looked up, whispering to herself, "This is the day." David Johnson stood beside her, his voice steady. "You're not alone anymore." Across the plaza, Mark Davis approached with Richard Hall, their confident strides cutting through the crowd. Sarah tightened her grip on her bag, her body tense but unyielding. Daniel Johnson was not there, safely at home with Emily Carter, who had returned to support her after her betrayal. Sarah's eyes locked with Mark's as he smirked, but this time she didn't flinch. She whispered, "Today, the truth wins." The courthouse doors loomed tall before her, and as she stepped forward, her heart carried every scar, every sacrifice, every vow. The storm was at its peak, but she was ready to face it, not as a victim, but as a warrior for her child's future. The courtroom was hushed as Judge Richard Bennett read his final decision. Sarah Johnson sat rigid, her breath locked in her chest. David Johnson sat behind her, his hand steady on her shoulder. Mark Davis leaned forward, his jaw tight, Richard Hall glaring at the judge. The words rang clear, "Full custody of Daniel Johnson is awarded to Sarah Johnson." Tears blurred Sarah's vision as her heart surged with relief and grief all at once. Mark slammed his fist against the table, his face twisted in rage, but the gavel struck hard, silencing him. Sarah whispered through trembling lips, "We made it, Daniel." Though her son wasn't present, his spirit filled her every thought. David whispered, "You did it." Sarah nodded faintly, her body shaking from the weight of the moment. The victory was real, but the scars were too. For Sarah, freedom carried a heavy cost, but it was worth every wound. Outside the courthouse, Sarah Johnson stepped into the gray daylight, the air crisp against her tear-streaked cheeks. Reporters called questions, their cameras flashing, but she ignored them, clutching her bag tightly. David Johnson walked beside her, shielding her from the crowd. Mark Davis emerged moments later, shouting angrily, his voice lost in the swarm of noise. Richard Hall pulled him back, his face grim. Sarah whispered to David, "He won't stop hating me." David replied firmly, "But he can't touch Daniel now." Relief battled exhaustion inside her chest, her every step heavy but resolute. She paused at the bottom of the courthouse steps, looking back at the building, whispering, "It's over." For the first time in years, her shoulders lowered slightly, though the storm still lingered in her heart. That evening, Sarah Johnson returned to the apartment where Daniel Johnson waited with Emily Carter. The boy ran into her arms the moment she opened the door, his voice bright, "Mom, you're back!" Sarah dropped to her knees, holding him tightly, whispering, "We're safe, Daniel, we're safe." Tears poured freely down her face as she clutched him with every ounce of strength. Emily Carter stood nearby, her eyes red with remorse and relief. "I'm sorry for everything, Sarah," she whispered. Sarah met her gaze, nodding faintly. "Thank you for being here now." David Johnson stepped into the apartment, watching quietly as the family embraced, the burden of years finally beginning to ease. In that small apartment, amidst flickering lamplight, Sarah realized victory was not in court papers but in the arms of her son. Later that night, Daniel Johnson fell asleep in his room, his small breaths filling the quiet apartment. Sarah Johnson stood at his doorway, her hand resting gently on the frame, watching him sleep. She whispered softly, "You are my strength, Daniel." David Johnson walked up behind her, his voice low, "You can finally breathe." Sarah nodded faintly, tears glistening in her eyes. Emily Carter sat quietly in the living room, offering silent support. The weight of the battle still pressed on Sarah's chest, but peace began to seep in. She whispered again, "We survive." For the first time in years, she believed the words. The apartment no longer felt like a cage, but a home rebuilt from the ruins. The next morning, the apartment was quiet, except for the sound of birds outside. Sarah Johnson stood in the kitchen, coffee mug in hand, gazing out the window. She whispered softly, "We were stronger now." Daniel Johnson padded into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes, and climbed onto a chair beside her. She smiled, kissing his hair, whispering, "Well, never stop fighting." David Johnson entered, placing his coat on the chair, his voice calm. "The future is yours now." Emily Carter joined with a small smile, her eyes still carrying apology and loyalty. Sarah breathed deeply, the light of dawn casting warmth on her face. She felt the scars of the past, but also the strength of survival. In that quiet moment, surrounded by those who mattered, she finally embraced not just survival but hope.